Thank you very much. In their combination of intensity and geographical extent, the 1848 revolutions were unique, at least in European history. Neither the Great French Revolution of 1789, nor the July Revolution of 1830, nor the Paris Commune of 1870, nor the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917 sparked a comparable transcontinental cascade. 1989 looks like a better comparator, but there's still controversy as to whether these uprisings can really be characterized as revolutions, and in any case, their direct impact was largely limited to the Warsaw Pact states in the east of Europe. In 1848, by contrast, parallel political tumults broke out across the entire continent, from Switzerland and Portugal to Wallachia and Moldavia in what is today's Romania, from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Holland to Palermo and the Ionian Islands. This was the only truly European revolution that there has ever been. But it was also, in some respects, a global upheaval, or at least a European upheaval with a global dimension. The news of revolution in Paris had a profound impact on the French Caribbean, and the measures adopted by London to avoid revolution on the British mainland triggered protests and uprisings across the British imperial periphery. In the young nations of Latin America, too, the European revolutions galvanized liberal and radical political elites. Even in far-off Australia, where I come from, the February Revolution created political waves, though it wasn't until the 19th of June 1848 that the news of the February events in Paris actually reached Sydney in the colony of New South Wales, a reminder of what the Australian historian Geoffrey Blainey once mournfully described as the tyranny of distance. The revolutions involved a vast panorama of charismatic actors, from Giuseppe Garibaldi to the Romanian radical Ana Ipatescu, from the French socialist Louis Blanc, author of a famous study printed in the 1840s of the organization of labor, l'Organisation du Travail, to the leader of the Hungarian nationalist movement, Lajos Kossuth, or Kossuth Lajos, from the brilliant conservative liberal social theorist, historian, and political writer Alexis Charles-Henri Clérel de Tocqueville, to the troubled priest Félicité de Lamennais, whose ultimately unsuccessful struggle to reconcile his faith with his politics made him one of the most famous and interesting thinkers of the pre-1848 world, from Georges Sand, who refused to stand for election to the French National Assembly on the grounds that for as long as women, legally at least, remained under the tutelage and the dependency of men, they could not be free political agents, to the Roman popular tribune Angelo Brunetti, known affectionately as Cicceroacchio or Chickpea. If you look at him, you can see why. A true man of the people, very popular, mainly because he was a wine wholesaler, which meant whenever he arrived, he had wine with him, which makes you popular in Rome. And he did much to shape the unfolding of the Roman Revolution of 1848-49. Not to mention, of course, the countless women, whose names by and large are not known, who sold broadsheets and newspapers in the streets of the European cities, or fought at the barricades. They're very prominent in contemporary visual depictions of these revolutions. We see here a woman involved in carrying away a wounded insurgent, and here, of course, a woman on a barricade in Paris, and there simply a woman socializing with insurgents during the March days. For politically sentient Europeans, 1848 was an all-encompassing moment of shared experience. It turned everyone into contemporaries, branding them with memories that would last as long as life itself. These revolutions were experienced as European upheavals. The evidence for this is superabundant in the contemporary sources. But, as the UCL historian Axel Kohner has pointed out, they were nationalized in retrospect. The historians and memory managers of the European nations absorbed them into specific national teleologies and path dependencies. The supposed failure of revolution in Germany was sucked into the German national narrative known as the Sonderweg, the special path, where it helped to power a thesis about Germany's aberrant road to modernity, a road that culminated in the disaster of the Hitler dictatorship. Something similar happened in Italy, where the supposed failure of revolution in 1848 was seen as pre-programming an authoritarian drift into the new Italian kingdom and thereby paving the road to the March on Rome in 1922 and the fascist seizure of power that followed. In France, the failure of 1848 was seen as ushering in the Bonapartist interlude of the Second Empire, which in turn anticipated the future triumph of Gaullism. In other words, focusing on the supposed failure of 1848 also had the consequence of allowing them to be absorbed into a plurality of parallel nation-state-focused narratives. Nothing demonstrates better than these connected upheavals and their fate in modern memory. Nothing demonstrates better than this the immense power of the nation-state as a way of framing or distorting the historical record and historical memory. We're still feeling that power today. There were three phases to the events in 1848, and the chronology is a bit baggy, but it's worth revisiting it just very briefly. In February and March 1848, these are the so-called spring days, or the March days. They start in February in Paris. There's Berlin in March. There's Budapest, and also in March. There's Sándor Petőfi reading out the text of the Nemzeti Dal, the national song, which he wrote himself, still one of the main sort of national song texts for contemporary Hungarians. There's Verrazzi's painting of the 5 days in Milan. And there's an inspection of the National Guard, effectively taxpayers under arms who've been brought in, drafted in, or actually they were volunteers, brought in to replace the army and allow the troops to be removed from urban space. So these were the spring days. Upheaval spread like a brush fire across the continent, leaping from city to city and starting numerous spot fires in towns and villages in between. The Austrian Chancellor Metternich fled from Vienna. The Prussian army was withdrawn from Berlin, had to move out to Potsdam. The kings of Piedmont, Sardinia, Denmark, and Naples all issued constitutions. It all seemed so easy. This was a Tahrir Square moment. One could be forgiven for thinking that the movement encompassed the entirety of society. The euphoria of unanimity was intoxicating. It felt, one German radical later recalled, as if we were walking on air. In Milan, complete strangers embraced each other in the streets. These were the spring days. The weather was actually a little bit like today. Yet the divisions within the upheaval, already latent in the first hours of the conflict, soon became glaringly apparent. In May, radical demonstrators were already attempting to storm and overthrow the National Assembly, created by the February Revolution in Paris, while in Vienna, Austrian Democrats protested against the slowness of liberal reforms and established a Committee of Public Safety, a term, of course, with very deep resonances in a society whose politically literate classes all remembered the events of the great Paris, of the great French Revolution of 1789, particularly the part of 1793 and 94, marked by the Jacobin dictatorship. And of course, it was the Jacobin Convention that established a Committee of Public Safety. In June, there were violent clashes between the liberal, or in France, Republican leaderships and radical crowds on the streets of the larger cities in Prussia and in France. And in Paris, this culminated in the brutality and bloodshed of the so-called June days, which killed at least 3,000 Parisian insurgents. This was the long, hot summer of 1848. Here we see fighting there. You note the flag with the word du pain ou la mort. We want bread or death. It's social demands that are prevalent here, not political ones. Image of the intimacy and sort of cruelty of the fighting on the Rue Soufflot around a barricade, and Ernest Meissonier's marvelous depiction of a barricade after the fighting's done, strewn with corpses. And here's the man who ran the Republic's counter-revolution against itself, the right Republic's counter-revolution against the left Republic, General Cavaignac. These days are, of course, gleefully diagnosed by Karl Marx as the moment at which the revolution lost its innocence and the sweet but deceptive unanimity of spring made way for the bitter struggle between classes. The autumn of 1848 offers a more complex picture. In September, October, and November, counter-revolution unfolded in Berlin, Prague, the Kingdom of Naples, Vienna, and Prussia. And here you see the deputies being sent home by troops from their parliament, which had been moved from Berlin to the little rural town of Brandenburg. And here the troops, Austrian troops, or troops of the Austrian army, they weren't all, well, they were Austrians, but they weren't all Germans, fighting under Field Marshal Windischgrätz, closing in on Vienna to shut down the revolution in the city. Parliaments were closed, insurgents were arrested and sentenced, troops returned en masse to the streets of the cities. But at the same time, a second phase, radical revolt, dominated by, this time, by Democrats and socialists of various kinds, broke out in the southern German states, especially Baden and Württemberg. Here we see two images of insurrection in Lörrach in Baden, street fighting in Frankfurt, and then Dresden in May 1849, in western and southern France, and in Rome, where the radicals, after the flight of the Pope on the 24th of November 1848, eventually declared a Roman Republic. There you see it being proclaimed. In the south of Germany, this second wave upheaval was only extinguished in the summer of 1849. So these really aren't just the revolutions of 1848, they're the revolution, they extended into 1849, and martial law remained in place in many parts of Central Europe until into the early 1850s. In Germany, in the south of Germany, it was Prussian troops that broke up significant forces near Mannheim in June, and the struggle came to an end with the disarming of insurgents at the fortress of Rastatt. They'd been promised a safe passage if they handed over their arms, which they did, but the safe passage was not granted, and instead many of them were found guilty of rebellion and executed on the walls, against the walls of the fortress. One of them who escaped was Karl Schurz, who went on to become a general of the Union Army in the German Civil War. Some of these people had, in the American Civil War, some of these people had extraordinary transnational careers. And shortly afterwards, in August 1849, French troops crushed the Roman insurgency, the Roman Republic. There you see them assaulting the Aurelian walls of Rome, again in the summer of 1849. And around about the same time, the bitter war over the future of the Kingdom of Hungary was brought to an end as Austrian and Russian troops occupied the country. By the end of the summer of 1849, the revolutions were largely over. And that gives a sense, that map gives a sense of the complexity of some of these wars, which involved multiple international interventions, in this case, particularly importantly, Russian troops entering via Wallachia and Moldavia, in other words, via Romania from the Black Sea, to help put down the Hungarian Revolution. These bitter and often very violent days of reckoning meant, among other things, or they mean, among other things, that the narrative of these revolutions lacks a moment of redemptive closure. And it was precisely the stigma of failure that put me off these revolutions when I first encountered them at school. Complexity and failure are an unattractive combination. Why then should we make the effort today of reflecting on 1848? There are many reasons, it seems to me, why we should do so, but tonight I want to touch on just a few. The first, I'm sure you've guessed it already, is that the 1848 revolutions were in fact not a failure at all. In many countries, they produced swift and lasting constitutional and administrative change. It's more interesting to think of this continental uprising as the particle collision chamber at the center of Europe's 19th century. People, groups, and ideas flew into it, crashed together, fused or fragmented, and emerged in showers of new entities, whose trails can be traced through the decades that followed. Political movements and ideas from socialism and democratic radicalism to liberalism, nationalism, corporatism, syndicalism, and conservatism were all tested in this chamber. All were transformed with profound consequences for the modern history of Europe. The revolutions also produced, notwithstanding the persistence of failure as a way of thinking about them, a profound transformation in political and administrative practices across the continent, a European revolution in government. I want to come back to this point very briefly at the end of the lecture. The second point is that the questions that the insurgents of 1848 asked have not lost their power. There are exceptions, obviously. We no longer rack our brains over the temporal power of the papacy or over the Schleswig-Holstein question, although I do have a few colleagues who still worry about those things. But by and large, the general public does not. But we do still worry about what happens when demands for political or economic liberty conflict with demands for social rights. Freedom of the press was all very well, the radicals of 1848 never tired of pointing out, but what was the point of a newspaper if you were too hungry to read it? The problem was captured by German radicals in the playful juxtaposition of the freedom to read, Pressefreiheit, with the freedom to feed, Fressefreiheit. For Isaiah Berlin, that question remained one of the central questions of liberalism, the question of whether you should give someone who is both very poor and very unfree, should you give that person liberty or boots? And of course his answer was always liberty first. But that's a liberal answer, not a radical one. The spectre of pauperization had loomed over the 1840s. How was it possible that even people in full-time work could scarcely manage to feed themselves? Entire sectors of manufacture, weavers were the most prominent example, appeared to be engulfed by this predicament. But what did this tide of immiseration mean? What was the gaping inequality between rich and poor simply a divinely ordained feature of man's estate, as the conservatives claimed, or was it a symptom of backwardness and overregulation, as liberals claimed? Or was it something generated by the political and economic system in its current incarnation, as the radicals insisted? Conservatives looked to moral reform and charitable amelioration. Liberals looked to economic deregulation and industrial growth. But radicals were less sanguine. To them it seemed that the entire economic order was founded upon the exploitation by the stronger of the weaker. These questions have not faded away. The problem of the working poor is today one of the hot-button issues in social policy, and not just in Britain. And the relationship between capitalism and social inequality is, of course, still under scrutiny. Particularly difficult was the question of labor. What if work itself became a scarce commodity? The downturn in the business cycle in the winter and spring of 1847-48 had pushed hundreds of thousands of men and women across Europe out of work. Did citizens have the right to demand that, if necessary, labor be apportioned to them as something essential to a dignified existence? It was the effort to answer this question that produced the controversial national workshops in Paris, Ateliers Nationaux. But it was never going to be easy to persuade hard-working farmers in the Limousin, for example, to part with extra taxes in order to fund work creation schemes for men they regarded as Parisian layabouts. And here is a hostile contemporary caricature of what went on at the national workshops. On the other hand, it was the sudden closure of the workshops, which poured 100,000 disgruntled unemployed men back onto the streets of the capital, that triggered the violence of Paris's juiced June days. The Düsseldorf artist, Johann Peter Cleaver, captured the same issue in his brilliant canvas, Workers Before the City Council. Painted in 1849 and widely exhibited in a number of versions, though it shows an event, by the way, from October 1848, and widely exhibited in a number of versions, it shows a delegation of laborers whose work creation scheme, which involved excavation works on the various arms of the River Rhine, had just been shut down in the autumn of 1848 for lack of funds. They're seen here presenting a petition of protest to the city fathers of Düsseldorf in an opulent council chamber. Through a large window, an orator can be seen on the square addressing a raging crowd. Karl Marx loved this painting for its stark depiction of what he saw as the conflict between classes. In a rave review for the New York Tribune, he praised the artist for conveying with, and I quote, dramatic vitality, in one image, a state of affairs that a progressive writer could only hope to analyze over many pages of print. Questions about social rights, poverty, and the right to work tore the revolutions apart during the summer and autumn of 1848, and they cannot be said to have lost any of their urgency. A third point. As a non-linear, convulsive, intermittently violent and transformative unfinished revolution, 1848 remains an interesting study for present-day citizens. In 2010 to 11, many journalists and historians noted the uncanny resemblance between the untidy sequence of diverse upheavals that are sometimes called the Arab Spring and the revolutions of 1848, also known as the springtime of the peoples. Like the upheavals in the Arab states, they were diverse, geographically dispersed, and yet connected. The single most striking feature of the 1848 revolutions was their simultaneity. This was a puzzle to contemporaries and has remained one to historians ever since. It also happens to be one of the most enigmatic features of the recent Arab events, still poorly understood and poorly explained. They had deep local roots, but they were clearly also interlinked. It would obviously be tedious to push this parallel too far. In a lot of ways, Cairo's Tahrir Square was not like the Piazza San Marco in Venice, and the Vossische Zeitung, or the Königlich Privilegierte Berlinische Zeitung, was not Facebook, as you can see. There are no apps on it, for example. The important point is a more general one. In their swarming multitudinousness, in the unpredictable interaction of so many forces operating along so many different vectors, the upheavals of the mid-19th century did resemble the chaotic upheavals of our own day, in which clearly defined endpoints are hard to come by. The revolution of 1848, or the revolutions of 1848, were revolutions of assemblies. The Constituent Assembly in Paris, which made way for the single-chamber legislature known as the Assemblies nationale, the Prussian Constituent Assembly, or Nationalversammlung in Berlin, which, as you can see, didn't have a building of its own. Obviously, there hadn't been a parliament in Prussia until 1848, so it met in the Berliner Singakademie. It was elected and convoked under new laws created for that purpose. The Frankfurt Parliament, which came together in the elegant circular chamber of St. Paul's Church in the city of Frankfurt, and then the Hungarian Diet. Now, the Hungarian Diet as such was actually a very old body dating back into the early 16th century, but in the course of the Hungarian revolutions of 1848, a new national diet came together in the city of Pest. You see it here. And when the Austrian Emperor Ferdinand I dissolved the diet by decree, a new Hungarian assembly met in the Protestant Great Church of Debrecen. Here we see an image of Debrecen. Here we see an image of that. The revolutionary insurgents of Naples, Piedmont, Sardinia, Tuscany, and the Papal States all established new parliamentary bodies. The revolutionaries of Sicily, seeking to break away from the rule of Naples, founded their own all-Sicilian parliament, which in April 1848 deposed the Bourbon king in Naples, Ferdinando II, still the sovereign also of the island of Sicily. But the assemblies were merely one theatre of action. By the summer of 1848, they were not just under pressure from the monarchical executives in many states, so that was certainly also the case, but also from a range of competing agencies of more radical colour. Networks of clubs and committees, for example, or radical counter-assemblies such as the General Crafts and Manufacturing Congress, founded in Frankfurt in July 1848, to represent those workers in the skilled trades whose interests were not represented in the liberal and middle-class dominated National Assembly. Even this body split after 5 days into two separate congresses because it proved impossible to bridge the divide between masters and journeymen and apprentices. Liberals revered parliaments, and they looked with disgust and alarm upon the clubs and assemblies of the radicals, which seemed to them to parody the sublime procedural culture of properly elected and constituted chambers. Even more disturbing from the perspective of chamber liberals, as they were sometimes called, was the prospect of organized demonstrations prepared to intervene directly in the affairs of parliaments. Exactly this happened in Paris on the 15th of May 1848, when a crowd broke into the lightly guarded chamber of the National Assembly, disrupted the proceedings, read out a petition, and then marched off to the Hôtel de Ville to proclaim an insurrectionary government, to be headed by noted radical personalities. The tension between parliamentary and other forms of representation, between representative and direct forms of democracy, is another feature of 1848 that resonates with today's political scene, in which parliaments face a fall in public esteem and a diverse array of competing non- or extra-parliamentary groups has emerged using social media and organizing around issues that may not command the attention of professional politicians. One interesting point emerges from the chaotic closing phase of the revolutions, and that is that there was an international, but it was not revolutionary, as the radicals and some of the liberals had claimed or at least hoped. It was counter-revolutionary. The Prussians intervened against the revolution in Baden and Württemberg. The French intervened in the Papal States against the Roman Republic. In fact, they reinstalled the papacy. The Russians intervened in Hungary to crush the Hungarian national revolution. The radicals and liberals were impressively successful in creating transnational networks, but these networks were horizontal. They lacked the vertical structures and resources required to wield decisive force. The counter-revolution, by contrast, drew on the combined resources of armies whose loyalty to the traditional powers had never been seriously in question. To borrow Neil Ferguson's binary categories, towers prevailed over squares. Hierarchies beat networks. Power prevailed over ideas and arguments. The effort to make sense of this outcome gave rise to one of the most interesting and important intellectual consequences of this revolution: the quest for theories or forms of politics founded not on ideas, but on the realities of force. You find this same quest in Marx and Engels, especially Engels. In Ludwig Rochau's Realpolitik, he's the inventor of that term, Realpolitik, in the Saint-Simonian technocracy that infiltrated administrative practice in France after 1848, and in the primacy of blood and iron, so memorably articulated by Bismarck. 1848 wasn't just a story of revolutionaries. 20th and 21st century historians of liberal instincts have naturally been drawn to the cause of those whose demands, whether they were for freedom of association, speech in the press, for constitutions, regular elections, and parliaments, whose demands have entered the DNA of modern liberal democracy. But while I share this genetic affinity for newspaper reading, coffee drinking, process-oriented liberals, it seems to me, I imagine perhaps quite a few people in this room do, it seems to me that an account that views events only from an insurgent or liberal or radical standpoint will miss an essential part of the drama and meaning of these revolutions. It was a complex, or they were a complex encounter between old and new powers, in which the old ones did as much to shape the shorter and longer-term outcomes of these revolutions as the new. Even this correction falls short, though, because the old powers that survived the revolution were themselves transformed by it. The future Prussian minister-president and German statesman, German chancellor later, after 1871, Otto von Bismarck, was still a small player in 1848, but the revolution enabled him to fuse his personal destiny with the future of his country, Prussia. Throughout his life, he continued to acknowledge 1848, strangely enough, for a man who manifested himself in such a counter-revolutionary way. He continued to acknowledge 1848 as a rupture between one epoch and another, as a moment of transformation without which his own career would have been unthinkable. The papacy of Pius IX was profoundly altered by the revolutions, as was the Catholic Church and its relationship with the modern world. Today's Catholic Church is in many respects the fruit of that moment. Louis Napoleon III did not depict himself or think of himself as the crusher of revolution, but as the restorer of order. He spoke of the need not to block, but to channel the forces unleashed by the revolution, to establish the state as the vanguard of material progress. That's not to say, of course, that he wasn't in favor of brutal counter-revolutionary measures where he felt these were required, but his central objective was to channel the revolution, to take it from the streets into the bosom of government, as he wrote himself in a pamphlet he published in the 1830s, Les Idées Napoléoniennes. This was an upheaval in which the lines between revolution and counter-revolution were and are sometimes hard to draw. Many 1848ers died or suffered exile and imprisonment for their convictions, but many others crossed the floor, making their peace with post-revolutionary administrations that had themselves been transformed or chastened by the revolutionary shock. Thus began a long march through the institutions. More than a third of the préfets, regional police officials of post-1848 Bonapartist France, were ex-radicals. So was the Austrian Minister of the Interior from July 1849, Alexander von Bach, whose name had once stood on the lists of suspect liberals kept by the Vienna Police Department. Counter-revolutionaries were as often as not, in their own eyes at least, the executors rather than the gravediggers of the revolution. Understanding that enables us to see more clearly how this revolution changed Europe. In memory, the revolutions, at least for its former participants, took on a stark, emotional chiaroscuro, the bright euphoria of the early days, and then the frustration, bitterness, and melancholy that came when the iron net of counter-revolution, as the Berliner Fanny Lewald put it, descended on the insurgent cities. Euphoria and disappointment were part of this story, but so was fear. Soldiers feared angry townsmen almost as much as the latter feared them. The sudden panics of crowds confronted by troops produced unpredictable surges that can be seen in every insurgent city. Fear, wrote Émile Thomas, architect of the national workshops in Paris and later a zealous Bonapartist, fear has been the presiding emotion of our revolution. Liberal leaders feared they might be unable to control the social energies unleashed by the revolution. People of humbler social standing feared that a conspiracy was underway to stitch up the revolution, reverse its achievements, and plunge them forever into poverty and helplessness. Urban middle-class residents winced when uncouth figures from the suburbs poured in through the city gates, now bereft of their military posts. They feared for their property and sometimes for their lives. In Palermo, there was a rough, diverse, and potentially ungovernable social undercurrent to the uprising in the city. The early leaders of the Palermo Revolution were stolid and predictable dignitaries who could be counted on to behave with moderation and good sense. But as Ferdinando Malvica, author of a major unpublished contemporary chronicle of the Palermitan Revolution, pointed out, the streets soon also filled with the armed maestranze, craftsmen's corporations, and, more disturbingly, with squads from the surrounding country. These, he wrote, were, and I quote, ferocious men, almost devoid of human feeling, as bloodthirsty as they were boorish, ugly people by whom the beautiful civic capital of Sicily found itself surrounded, infernal tribes, razze infernali, peopled only by creatures in whom nothing was human but their sunburnt countenances. It may be that without the driving force and supposed menace exercised by such people, the risings of 1848 could never have succeeded. On the other hand, a pervasive fear of the lower orders also paralyzed the revolution in its later stages, making it easy to play off different interests against each other, to woo liberals into the arms of the established authorities, and to isolate radicals as enemies of the social order. Specific displays of emotion could be developed as articulations of revolutionary sensibility, and some of these convey the distinctiveness of 1848 as a moment of middle-class revolt. The former apprentice gardener and left liberal deputy at the Frankfurt National Assembly, Robert Blum, agreed late in September 1848 to travel to Vienna. He was working as a deputy in Frankfurt, getting a bit bored with the proceedings because basically the parliament didn't seem to have very much interesting to do anymore. And so when the opportunity came up to travel to Vienna to bear the fraternal greetings of the German parliament to the Revolutionary Assembly in the Habsburg capital, he took the opportunity and did the job. His journey was badly timed, to put it mildly. He arrived just as the Austrian armies and Field Marshal Windischgrätz were closing in to crush the revolution in the city, and in the desperate fighting that followed, Blum accepted the command of a company of defending troops. And he's seen here in a contemporary lithograph, urging his men into battle from the top of a barricade. He survived the fighting, unharmed, but was captured after the surrender of the insurgent forces and sentenced to death, despite his very reasonable plea that as an emissary of the Frankfurt National Assembly on official deputy business, he enjoyed parliamentary immunity. That was overlooked or overruled, and you see the denouement. On his way to the Brigittenau, where he was to be shot by a company of Croat riflemen, a tear was seen to roll down one of his cheeks. When one of the officers, an Austrian, remarked, don't be afraid, Blum. He said, es ist im Nu vorüber. He said, don't be afraid, it will all be over in a jiffy. Fantastically comforting words. And hearing this remark, Blum brushed off the effort to comfort him, and drawing himself up to his full but not very great height, he retorted, this tear is not the tear of the parliamentary deputy of the German nation, Robert Blum. This is the tear of the father and the husband. Blum's tear was not forgotten. It entered liberal and radical legend. The song of the death of Robert Blum, sung across the southern German states well into the 20th century, includes a reference to this moment of private grief amidst the public ritual of a political execution. And here you see him there with the text. And forgive me now, but it goes roughly like this. Die Träne für Weib und Kinder entehret keinen Mann. Lebet wohl, jetzt gilt es zu sterben, für die Freiheit mit Blute zu werben. Ihr Jäger, wohl aufschlagt an. This tear, thank you. This tear lived on in memory precisely because it identified Blum as a man of middle-class attachments and values, a private man who had entered public life. This was politics in a bourgeois key. To this day, the phrase as dead as Robert Blum is still a proverbial expression in parts of southern Germany. If you want to say somebody's very dead, you say, yeah, he's as dead as Robert Blum. Counter-revolutionaries had emotions too, of course. Revolutionaries had no monopoly on those. At the end of an extraordinary speech to the United Diet in Berlin, in which Otto von Bismarck reluctantly declared that he now accepted the revolution as an irreversible historical fact and the new liberal ministry as, and I quote, the government of the future, he left the podium sobbing violently. These tears, unlike Blum's, were emphatically public, both in their performative character and in their causation. It's surely pertinent to the unlovely career of General Windischgrätz, faithful servant of the House of Habsburg and one of the gravediggers of the revolution in the Austrian lands, that his wife was shot dead and his son wounded while observing a demonstration from the windows of their residence during the Pentecost uprising in Prague in June 1848. The cry, Berlin pigs, Berliner Schweine, uttered by rural peasant army recruits from backwoods Brandenburg as they beat suspected barricade fighters in the capital with clubs and iron rods during the March days, tell us something, though certainly not everything, about the feelings that country youths brought to the tasks of urban counterinsurgency. Vengefulness and anger played a crucial role in the brutality of Austrian generals like Haynau, who appeared to delight in the death sentences and executions he meted out to defeated Hungarian insurgents. One of the striking things about these revolutions is the intensity of historical awareness among so many of the actors. This was one key difference between the 1848 revolutions and the French Revolution of 1789. Contemporaries of the revolutionary events read them against the template of the great original, and they did so in a world in which the concept of history had acquired a tremendous semantic weight. For them, much more than for the men and women of 1789, history was happening in the present. Its movements could be detected in every twist and turn of the revolution's development. For some, this connection made the events of 1848 miserable parodies of the great French original. The most eloquent exponent of that view was, of course, Marx in his 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. But for others, the relationship was the other way round. It was not that the epic energy of 1789 had wasted away into caricature, but rather that the historical awareness made possible by the First Revolution had accumulated, deepened, and propagated itself more widely. The French Revolution of 1848 produced a powerful echo in Chile. The contemporary Chilean writer, journalist, historian, and politician Benjamin Vicuña Mackenna, a marvelously Chilean name, wrote in his memoirs, seen here with his wife, what's her first name? Victoria Zubercaso, and he added these words, which I think are very interesting. For us poor colonials living on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, he almost sounds like an Australian. For us poor colonials living on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, its predecessor, the predecessor of 1848, in 1789, so celebrated in history, had been but a flash of light in our darkness. Half a century later, its twin had every mark of brilliant radiance. We had seen it coming. We had studied it. We understood it. We admired it. And I think that's the great difference between the first time something happens and the second. I mean, there had been other tumults in between, but people felt that they could read this revolution in a way that had been completely unthinkable to those who experienced the New World of 1789 to 1815. Across Northern and Southern America, South Asia, and the Pacific Rim, the ripples generated by the European revolutions passed into complex societies, polarizing or clarifying political debates, reminding everyone of the malleability and fragility of all political structures. In the colonial Caribbean, the news of revolution triggered local insurrections that put an end to slavery, even before the metropolitan government could issue edicts of emancipation. And once the slaves of Martinique and Guadeloupe had secured their freedom, here we see the emancipation of the slaves after an insurrection reluctantly conceded by General Rostolan, who simply says, "You're all emancipated. We don't need an edict. It's over." And once the slaves of Martinique and Guadeloupe had grasped their own freedom with their own hands, it proved impossible to sustain the authority of the slave owners on the nearby Dutch islands of the Lesser Antilles, Saint-Martin, St. Eustatius, and Saba. And something broadly similar happened on Sainte-Croix, a Danish possession of the Lesser Antilles. In other words, the impact of edicts from the center mattered less, at least in the Caribbean, than what Sujit Sivasundaram has called the south-to-south signaling of societies on the colonial periphery. The news of 1848 initially prompted scenes of euphoria in the great American cities. There was broad support in the Senate for a motion by Senator William Allen of Ohio, there we see him, that the Senate should formally congratulate the French people, and I quote, "upon their success in their recent efforts to consolidate liberty by embodying its principles in a republican form of government." Here are the Americans congratulating themselves on France's having at last chosen to follow America's example. But the news of the Caribbean slave emancipations complicated the issue. On the following day, when the debate on Allen's resolution began, Senator John P. Hale of New Hampshire proposed an amendment in which the French were additionally congratulated for, and I quote, "manifesting the sincerity of their purpose by instituting measures for the immediate emancipation of the slaves of all the colonies of the Republic," unquote. It was this amendment that brought the pro-slavery senators into open opposition. The great pro-slaver, Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, a man with a remarkably frightening face. That's the face of pro-slavery. Spoke against this motion, conceding archly he was a super intelligent man, intellectually extremely able, but he was very much a very passionate slaver. He spoke against the proposal, conceding archly that the upheaval was, to be sure, a wonderful event, but that the real test of a revolution was whether or not it would continue to guard against violence and anarchy, and that, as he put it, the time had not yet arrived for congratulation. Well, the motion to congratulate was kicked into the long grass. The point is sometimes made that if we compare the impact of 1848 worldwide with the transformative power of the transatlantic revolutions of the so-called axial era between the 1770s and the end of the Napoleonic Empire, then the global balance of our 1848 revolutions must appear rather modest. But this contrast is really only meaningful if we exclude from view the enormous political and social impact of warfare. Between 1792 and 1815, the continent was racked by wars in which vast conscript armies, on a scale never before seen, were pitted against each other in battles that beggared the imagination of contemporaries. 600,000 men took part in the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. And across the wider world, many places from India and the Caribbean to Egypt and Java were flexed by conflict among the great powers. Well, the revolutions of 1848 were different. They were not born in war. For all their cruelty, the wars sparked by the revolutions, Denmark, Italy, southern Germany, Hungary, were counter-revolutionary police actions that, for the most part, came to an end once order had been restored. They tended to shut the revolution down rather than to diffuse its ideology. A continental revolutionary power capable of projecting and embodying ideology by force of arms, in the manner of 1790s and 18-teens France, never emerged. In the absence of revolutionary armies, the good tidings of revolution in 1848 had to travel in civilian clothes. They arrived in the form of books, newspapers, and charismatic personalities. They reverberated in cafes and political clubs, circulating in communicative networks that were denser, socially deeper, and more sophisticated than their late 18th century predecessors. They could do this because the locations and societies we've examined were connected through imperial structures, through post-colonial social and cultural ties, through migrant diasporas, or through common institutions. The architecture of intercontinental communications was much more diverse and robust than at the turn of the century. After all, these revolutions, the revolutions of 1848, were the first overseas tumult to which several American newspapers sent their own correspondents. If the revolutions failed in most places outside Europe, the Caribbean was an obvious exception, to work deep social transformations, this was because in differentiated public spheres, the spectacle of revolution tended to trigger responses that were nuanced, selective, and ambivalent. The understanding of revolution that took root in such settings was not necessarily less deep or less important, it was just more subtle. The true legacy of 1848 on the European continent is to be seen in the breadth of administrative change triggered by the upheavals. Pragmatic, centrist coalitions emerged in the aftermath of the turmoil, the connubio, or the marriage between the left liberals and the flexible conservatives in Piedmont, in which Cavour was involved, the Unión Liberal in Spain, the Regeneração in Portugal, formations whose rhetoric and outlook marked a clear departure from the ideologically polarized positions of left and right in the pre-March era, the pre-1848 era. The rigid and unimaginative official censorship regimes of the Restoration gave way to a more nimble, collaborative, and systematic approach to the press. Governments scaled down the censorship apparatuses of the 1840s and went instead for systems of information management, involving media subsidies and the structured siphoning of news stories to selected newspaper editors. To a greater extent than ever before, the European governments of the post-revolutionary years legitimated themselves by reference to their capacity to stimulate and sustain economic growth. They refurbished Europe's cities, from Paris, transformed by Haussmann, to Vienna, where the old city walls were demolished to create space for the Ringstrasse, to Madrid, where the urban planners Mesonero and Castro transformed the inner city. They launched public works projects on a scale that exceeded anything attempted during the Restoration era. They established a technocratic romanticism, focused on the improvement of infrastructure and the pursuit of a form of material progress that would make the polarized politics of the 1840s obsolete, or so at least they hoped. In other words, and I want to close here, the revolutions of 1848 may have ended in failure, marginalization, exile, imprisonment, even death for some of their protagonists. But their momentum communicated itself like a seismic wave to the fabric of the European administrations, changing structures and ideas, bringing new priorities into government, or reorganizing old ones, reframing political debates. The Vienna-based political theorist Lorenz von Stein captured the meaning of these changes when he observed that, as a consequence of the revolutions, Europe had passed from what he called the Zeitalter der Verfassung, the age of constitution, to the Zeitalter der Verwaltung, to the age of administration. And the enabling phenomenon at the core of this transformation was the ascendancy of the political center over the polarized formations of left and right that had dominated the 1840s. Many radicals and conservatives moved inwards from the fringes to affiliate with centrist groups close to the state. Those who did not risked irrelevance and even ridicule. The result was a new kind of politics, uma nova política, as the Portuguese regenerators were fond of saying. It was, and I'm going to stop here, it was, one might say, the exact reverse of what is happening right now, when the center is weakening and ideas and personalities that once seemed extreme or outlandish command an increasing share of public attention. Thank you.
We will now take questions. We'll take questions. When you get the microphone, would you please speak into it and keep your questions concise?
Sorry, can we start? Oh.
Just one moment.
Yep.
Thank you for your lecture. I rather hoped you'd draw some parallels with today. Could you do that now?
I thought I had. Yeah, I suppose there's a few things two things come to mind above all. I've sort of hinted at them. One of them is this, I mean, there are problems with the 1850s and that dream of a kind of, technocratic, managerial approach to all of what had been politics, a sort of superseding, a supersession of politics by management or by, technocratic, quantitative expert assessment of the problems of the material needs of society. Let's put it that way. That dream of the 1850s obviously turned out to be short-lived. I mean, the left and the right do return, especially in the 1880s and 90s. The far left and the far right, and they take off again in the what Eric Hobsbawm called the age of extremes in the 20th century. So it's it's not a dream which is going to go on forever, but in a way there is a sort of revival of that sort of post-crisis technocracy after 1945, and that's the EU. The EU is a sort of flight into technocratic structures, away from the conflictual political models of a prior era, of the preceding age. And so I do see a sort of parallel there, and I think we're coming out of that now. And that connects to the other point, which is that, about the fact that what the 1850s see, what enables people to put the hungry 1840s behind them, is a sort of an ascendancy of the center, it's the chief marker of its success is that people, the people who had corporate romantic conservatives who wanted to make the revolution unhappen, are now irrelevant. I mean, they're just obsolete figures. They're mocked in the press, even in the official government press, and they sort of disappear from public view, or they cease to be interesting. I mean, nobody does anything against them, but they just cease to be relevant or interesting personalities. And the same applies to the hard left edge of the old radical groups. So the center, in a very broad sense, drawing ideas from left and right, but operating, as it were, from a kind of broad center, rules supreme in that sense. And I think what we're seeing now is the exact reversal of that. But I've already made that point. One further thought is that, it's very striking when you look at the people who are caught up in 1848, how European their frame of reference is. Cavour wrote, I was very struck, I remember when I read a piece that Cavour wrote, a long article that he wrote, a sort of essay, about the Irish question in 1846. It's an incredibly subtle and well-informed question, and I wonder how many, of Italy's politicians, senior politicians today, could write a 10-page essay on Ireland. I very much doubt that there's even one. How many of the senior politicians anywhere in Europe today possess that sense that the continent is a joined-up cultural system? Of course, they did that. We're talking here about elites, and these elites had been trained and educated in very similar ways. They'd often traveled to each other's countries. I mean, Cavour had been in Paris and Zurich, as well as in Piedmont. And that's the case with many of his contemporaries. They moved around a lot and learned more than just one language. So in a sense, I'm very struck by how much more European people were then and how difficult it seems to be to relearn how to be European. The nation so deep is the impact of the nation state on our awareness. So that would be my response to your
question from the far.
Sorry, my name's Robert Fox. I've been a journalist for 52 years, and I've worked in a way as much in Italy as I have in this country. By the way, I would rather query what you said. I know many senior civil servants and politicians in Italy who could probably write you a very decent essay on nationalism and Ireland. So we'll park that. Wonderful talk. Thank you very much. And excellent food for thought, particularly at this time. And I don't mean to be condescending, but there was two things that struck me from it.
Yeah.
One is that you emphasized about partiti politici, movements and so on in the 1848, 1849 crisis. which does resonate with today, is how they became less matters of political debate and arrangement, but cults.
Yeah.
The cult of the charismatic individual, I'd like you to comment on that. And the other thing which you have raised, you've trailed as a ghost, if I'm allowed this one, is those that got left behind. We know the artifact more than art of the Gattopardo of Lampedusa is what happened with those that left behind. And it's the left behind that we're looking at now, whether it's in the Brexit revolt or the jacquerie of the Gilets jaunes. Would you care to comment on those two aspects, please?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that would be another parallel with the present. If I just start with your second comment first. Yeah, the left behinds, or people who feared to be left behind or already were left behind, that was an absolutely central question for the revolution, and a central reason for its failure was the fact that in France you have the sort of right wing of the revolution foreclosing the left. And the political revolution shuts down the social revolution, and often very, very violently. It's different in Central Europe, where the whole question is overshadowed by nationalism. There it gets more, that's the multivectoral quality of these conflicts. But even there, you have people having to face really difficult choices. If you're a Romanian radical, does that mean you join the Hungarian radicals, or do you join the Romanian nationalists? Or the Ruman nationalists who want, a Transylvania which is not going to be oppressed by some new Magyar Hungarian state. So these kinds of choices tear the movement apart along every possible fault line. And I think it is a feature today of the debate we see over Europe that the critique of Europe has a social dimension as well as a political one. I mean, the argument, for example, which one hears from the left, that Europe has been insufficiently sensitive to the social demands of people who that there's been a drifting apart of life worlds and a sort of heightening of the income pyramid and a drifting apart of different worlds of experience, also between South and North, between the southern European states and the northern ones. In other words, that the failure to attend to issues of equality of opportunity and also just equality of quality of life, equal access to meaningful forms of labor and so on, that has undermined the coherence or the coherence of the European project in ways that perhaps an excessively liberal and technocratically aligned or attuned elite had failed to anticipate. So in that sense, there is a parallel. I like very much your thought about how parties become cults. There's no shortage of cult personalities at this time. Friedrich Hecker is one wonderful South German radical cult figure who's remembered in many lithographs in which it looks like he's Christ returning after the crucifixion, being adored by his people. Mazzini was uniformly described as priestly, possessing a priestly dignity. Garibaldi was an extraordinary cult figure who was worshipped rather than followed. There are many characters like that. And it's true that when parties develop that cultic, quasi-confessional dimension, then pragmatic reasoning and horse trading get more difficult. And I think that happened, and just as it is today. Thank you for your comments. And you're quite right, by the way, about that there still exists a European an EU elite, which would be, and EU Italians who'd be brilliant at writing an essay on Ireland. It's just that they don't occupy political office. They're senior civil servants who are, this kind of much maligned cadre of EU functionaries is actually one of the most magnificently educated and civilized groups of human beings that has ever been created. But anyway, we'll leave that to one side.
Could I ask you to reflect on the relationship between Britain and the rest of Europe in '48?
Yeah.
Britain obviously was on the verge of a mass unrest with the Chartists. Why didn't it revolt?
That's a very interesting question. I remember when I was a school boy learning about this, the answer we were given was, well, Britain didn't need to have an 1848 because Britain was too liberal already. Things were already so good for the British that they didn't need to revolt. That turns out not quite to have been the case, and that's why there were so many Chartists. Why it didn't break out into a revolution? Well, one good answer, I think, has been given by Miles Taylor, who wrote a fantastic essay about this for Past and Present many years ago. Not that many years ago, but some time ago, in which he argued that, it's a little bit along the lines of what I was saying, which is drawn from that article, that Britain franchised out its social tensions to the imperial periphery. So although Chartism was a very serious threat, and I'll come back to that in a moment, they reduced the risk of mass subsistence crisis-driven disaffection by keeping the price of staple goods down, firstly by relieving lower middle-class taxpayers and middle-class taxpayers of their tax burdens and pushing fiscal burdens onto the periphery, places like Ceylon, for example, where taxes were raised while they were kept low in Britain, and secondly, keeping the prices of staples like sugar down by removing the preferential tariffs on goods coming in from other places than the British Empire. So in other words, they allowed goods from anywhere to come in, got the prices of staples down, but at the cost, of course, of planters and of local elites in places like Jamaica. So what you have is, a revolt and protests in places like Jamaica and Ceylon, but peace on the British mainland. So in other words, they franchised out. The British leadership, in a very sophisticated way, franchised some of the problems, some of the social problems that drove revolution on the continent out to the imperial periphery. And it's very interesting to read the Sydney Morning Herald. In those days, a wonderful newspaper. I'll say no more than that. But in any case, beautifully written, and to read the burghers of the Sydney Morning Herald commenting on this and saying, well, why the dear old mother country hasn't had violence and bloodshed to compare with France. The reason is because they can send all their undesirables out to places like this. Right, and they were not wrong. I mean, a lot of Sons of Free Ireland and other sort of ne'er-do-wells had been transported to Australia, and in fact, 1848 triggers a protest movement, as it does in the Cape Colony, to end transportation, and indeed convict transportation stops to these imperial destinations stopped shortly after 1848. One last point: how is it possible to keep the Chartists down? Well, by the deployment of immense coercive resources. 80,000 special constables are mobilized in order to prevent Chartism from taking hold or from causing a serious public order threat. And among those special constables is none other than the future Napoleon III. But the only thing he gets to do, by the way, is to arrest what he describes in his memoirs as a very drunk woman.
Professor, the theory you were putting out was that centrism took hold as a result of the failure of any of the revolutions to take hold in regime change in the way it did in 1789. Do you think if it had, and one of these had succeeded in creating a state that fulfilled the ambitions of the 1848 revolutionaries, that it would have been much harder then for that kind of centrist politics to take hold?
That's a very interesting question, because it raises the question of, because people say 1848 was unfinished or a failure or whatever. Then you have to ask yourself, when does a revolution succeed? And if you think about these, the revolutions we think of as major landmarks of history, the French Revolution of 1789, at what point did it succeed, and in whose eyes? There was never one revolution. That's the point. And in France, of course, in the 1789 model, which was playing through like a movie in the back of everybody's heads in 1848, was about how one revolution succeeded another and was then succeeded by another. So the Revolution of Liberty of 1789 is followed by the Revolution of Equality and then of Fraternity. Forced fraternity. You must not keep anything privately if it should be shared among your brothers. That's the revolution of the Jacobins of 1793 and 94. And then the freezing of, and then the sort of unhappy attempts of the Directory to try and botch together a compromise solution which doesn't work. And then the seizure of power by Napoleon and the freezing into institutional form of the sort of centralizing impulses of the revolution. At what point would you say the revolution was finished, or at what point had it succeeded? And the same problem applies to 1848. What would it mean to imagine that in some place or another the revolution succeeded? It would have to be, you'd have to ask yourself, well, which revolutionaries would think of this as a success? Some radicals thought the revolution had failed within a few weeks of its outbreak. And you read that a lot in radical letters and correspondence. It's over, it's finished. The revolution's given up the ghost. But liberals still felt there was everything to play for. And in fact, the troops, the question has been asked in the case of the Prussian army, a wonderful book by a historian called Sabrina Müller, and she has argued that, she's asked the question, which I think is a really interesting question, Why did the soldiers of these armies, who were recruited from the same proletarian milieu as the insurgents, why didn't they run across to the barricades and join them? And she says, the reason is because most of the men serving in the Prussian army believed when they attacked insurgents in the summer and autumn of 1848, and again in the summer of 1849, they believed they were protecting the moderate revolution of March against the radical social revolution of summer and autumn. So there again, this division opens up, and the question is whose revolution is supposed to prevail? And that's one of the real difficulties. And that's why that sort of Tahrir Square moment lasted for such a short time and broke up. So that would be my response, I think, to your question, that it's a very interesting mental experiment, but it opens up precisely these problems that the revolutionaries of that time faced.
Thank you. You emphasized the sort of the pan-European character of these revolutions, but I've had the impression that nationalism played a pretty big role in these revolutions, and certainly some of the people you mentioned were known as nationalists. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of nationalism.
Absolutely. Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, nationalism is central to these revolutions, though it depends where you are. I mean, the further east you go, the more important it becomes. It's not so important in France or Holland or Belgium. In Belgium, nationalism had been more important in 1830-31. But in places like Hungary, it obviously is, and nationalism could be disintegrative. It could be about pulling your country either out of or into a more autonomous relationship to some kind of multi-ethnic commonwealth, as was the case for the various subject peoples of the Habsburg monarchy, the Austrian Empire, or it could be integrative, like the Italian nationalists who wanted to pull together the 7 different states of the Italian peninsula and make it into one country, or the German nationalists who wanted to achieve some kind of union of the 39 states, possibly minus Austria. So yes, nationalism is very, very important. That doesn't make it. It's not, as it were, evidence that this is. It's not a counter argument to the argument about the pan-European quality of this, because nationalism itself was a transnational European phenomenon, and it was constantly exchanging DNA. National movements were learning from each other all the time and reacting to each other, and that's not just a sort of a Jesuitical point. It's a serious one that in the 1830s and 40s. Think of Turgenev's novel On the Eve, where he describes a Bulgarian nationalist who's the subject of the Ottoman Empire, who goes to Venice and is sort of hanging about in the Piazza San Marco, and he pulls the kind of brim of his hat down low, so as he doesn't have to see the muzzles of the Austrian cannon poking out between the columns of the church, because he's so horrified at the idea of another people's oppression. There was a lot of this in Europe. People gathered money for the Polish question, in the 1840s. Polenvereine in Germany, for example, Polish clubs, Greek clubs during the Greek Revolution between the 1821 to the early 1830s. So, in other words, there's a lot of vicarious nationalism, people sharing enthusiasm for each other's causes. What happens after 1848 is that begins to come to an end. And that, I think, is what you're suggesting. 1848 is, if you like, in some ways, a moment of de-Europeanization. It's the beginning of the era that we're still in, where the nation-state comes to wield a kind of primary claim on people's affiliations. And we're still living with the effects of that moment. But 1848 is still on the cusp between an older, much more European world and something which is going to be more sundered into national camps. I hope that is an answer to your question.
Amongst the revolutionary years you've compared 1848 with, you haven't mentioned 1968. I don't know whether you feel able to reflect upon the significance of that year, but clearly there were global dimensions in 68, and also, of course, most importantly, a sense of failure came from that. But perhaps also you might be able to suggest some unintended consequences, rather, as you did with the 1848 revolution.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought about. There is a sort of shadow of a parallel there in the phrase "the long march through the institutions," because of course that's one of the interesting things about the 68ers. Is the the people who start, throwing Molotov cocktails at the police and so on, people like Joschka Fischer, end up being foreign ministers, and well, not just foreign ministers. It's a school for in political awareness and maturation and so on, which takes people into all kinds of locations. They don't remain in that radical position, and I wish I knew more about 1968. I don't know enough to give you a really subtle answer to that, but I'm sure that it would be interesting to think of 1968 as a transformative revolution. I know that I feel very intuitively, very strongly, and also from Germans that I've spoken to, that it had a deeply transformative effect in Germany. It really transformed the culture. And whether that's also the case for France and for the other places where it took very intense forms, I don't know, but I imagine it may well also be. But that would be something well worth following up, a kind of revolution that succeeded despite itself.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for coming, and please give...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.